What if almost everything you've heard about EV charging stations is wrong? We're constantly told that electric cars take forever to charge. Charging stations are difficult to find, and road trips become a nightmare the moment the battery gets low. But here's what most people miss. The biggest problem with EV charging may not actually be charging speed. It may be the way we're comparing electric cars to gasoline cars in the first place. Because once you understand how EV charging really works and what actually happens when an electric car needs more power, one of the most common arguments against EVs starts to look very different. The truth about EV charging is more complicated, more practical, and far more surprising than most people realize. The biggest criticism of electric vehicles is simple. Charging takes too long. You pull into a charging station, plug in, and wait while a gasoline car can often finish refueling in just a few minutes. At first, the comparison seems obvious, but there is a problem with it. We're assuming that every EV driver charges their car the same way. Every single time, most EV owners aren't constantly driving until the battery reaches zero and then searching for a charger. For many drivers, charging happens while they're already doing something else, at home overnight, at work during the day, while shopping, or while eating at a restaurant. That's fundamentally different from the traditional gas station experience. Think about your phone. You don't normally wait until the battery reaches zero and then stand beside an outlet watching it charge. You plug it in while you're sleeping, working, or doing something else. EV charging can work in a similar way, but that doesn't mean the criticism is completely wrong. Public charging can still be frustrating. Chargers can be occupied, unavailable, or slower than expected. And when you're on a long road trip, charging time matters much more because you're trying to get back on the road. So the real question isn't simply whether EV charging is fast. The real question is whether we're measuring it against the right standard. Because once you compare EV charging with the way people actually use their cars, not just with the few minutes spent at a gas station, the picture starts to look very different. And that's where the real story of EV charging begins. Here's where the EV debate gets interesting. For decades, we've been trained to think about refueling in one specific way. When the tank gets low, we stop, fill it up, and continue driving. The entire process can take only a few minutes. So naturally, we expect electric cars to work exactly the same way, but they don't have to. Think about your daily routine. You might drive to work, park your car for 8 hours, and then drive home. During all those hours, your car is simply parked. With an EV, some of that time can become charging time. Instead of making a separate trip to a station, you can plug the car in while you're sleeping or while you're working. Depending on the vehicle charger and how far you drive, you may have enough energy for most or all of the next day. And that's the part the 5-minute gas station comparison often ignores. But there is another side to the story. If you're driving hundreds of miles on a road trip, you can't simply leave your car plugged in overnight. You need a public charger, and now, charging speed matters. This is where gasoline still has a major advantage. A quick fuel stop can often get a gasoline vehicle back on the road much faster than a typical EV charging stop. So the comparison isn't completely wrong. It's just incomplete. EVs change the question from, how quickly can I refill, to, how often do I actually need to stop and recharge? And that difference changes how we should think about charging. Because once you stop measuring every EV charging session against a 5-minute gas station visit, the real question becomes much more interesting. What happens when an EV actually needs to charge during a normal day? And how much time does the driver really spend waiting? So what does charging an electric vehicle actually look like in everyday life? For drivers who can charge at home, it may be far less dramatic than the internet makes it sound. Imagine coming home after work, parking your car in the driveway or garage, plugging it in, and walking inside. That's it. You don't have to stand beside the car. You don't have to watch the battery percentage climb. You simply go about your evening. While you sleep, the car charges. And depending on how much you drive, the vehicle, and the charging equipment, you may have enough range for most or all of the next day's driving. This is where EV charging can become surprisingly convenient. Instead of making a separate trip to buy fuel, charging can happen while you're already doing something else. The same idea can work at workplaces, shopping centers, hotels, restaurants, and other destinations where charging is available. But this is where the EV charging story splits into two very different experiences. The convenience of charging depends heavily on where you live, where you park, and how you use your car. Someone with a garage and access to home charging may rarely need to use a public charger. Someone living in an apartment without a dedicated charging option can have a completely different experience. They may depend much more on public chargers, which can be occupied, unavailable, or inconveniently located. And that's why saying EV charging is convenient or EV charging is terrible doesn't tell the whole story. The real experience depends on a simple question. Where does your car spend most of its time when you're not driving it? Because if your car spends most of the day parked at home or at work, charging speed may matter far less than you think. But when home charging isn't an option, and especially when you're traveling long distances, the equation changes completely, and that's where EV charging gets much more complicated. But if we're being completely honest, EV charging has a weakness that can't simply be explained away. Public charging can be frustrating. Imagine you're on a long road trip, your battery is getting low, you finally find a charging station, and you pull in expecting a quick stop. Then you discover that every charger is occupied, or maybe one is out of service, another is delivering less power than expected, and the remaining chargers already have cars waiting. Now you're not just waiting for your vehicle to charge, you're waiting for another driver to finish, hoping the next charger actually works, and wondering how much battery you'll have left when you reach the next station. That's where the EV experience can become stressful. And the problem isn't always the number of chargers, it's reliability. A charging station can appear on a map, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will provide a smooth experience when you arrive. There can be payment problems, confusing apps, connection issues, or chargers that deliver less power than expected. For someone who drives an EV every day and has reliable access to charging, these problems may be manageable. But for someone considering an electric vehicle for the first time, one bad experience can create a powerful impression. And there is another problem here, one that has less to do with technology and more to do with human psychology. People don't always remember the 100 times something worked perfectly. They remember the one time it failed when they desperately needed it. That's why a single frustrating charging experience can have an outsized impact on how people view EVs. So yes, EV charging infrastructure is improving, but until public charging becomes consistently reliable, available, and simple to use, this criticism isn't going away. And now we reach an even more interesting question. Are we even measuring charging speed correctly? Here's something many people don't realize. An EV doesn't charge at the same speed from beginning to end. When conditions are right and the battery is at a lower state of charge, an EV can often accept power relatively quickly. But as the battery gets closer to full, charging generally slows down. And that creates an important misconception. People often hear the term fast charging and imagine the car will go from nearly empty to completely full in roughly the same amount of time it takes to make a quick gasoline stop. That's usually not how it works. The final portion of charging can take considerably longer than the earlier portion. So an EV driver on a road trip usually doesn't need to wait until the battery reaches 100%. Instead, the practical goal is often to add enough energy to continue the journey comfortably. Imagine stopping for lunch during a road trip. The goal isn't necessarily to leave with a completely full battery. It's to add enough range to reach your next destination or charging stop without unnecessary waiting. And that changes the way we should think about charging speed. The important question isn't always, how long does it take to reach 100%? A better question is, how much useful driving range can I add during the time I'm stopped? That's a much more practical way to evaluate an EV charging session, because charging speed absolutely matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. The bigger question is whether the charger is available, whether it works reliably, and how much useful range it can add before you're ready to continue. And that brings us to an important part of the EV charging equation that often gets overlooked. How much time does the driver actually spend waiting? The future of electric vehicles may depend on something beyond the cars themselves. Charging infrastructure, because building millions of electric vehicles is one challenge. Building enough infrastructure to support them is another. Imagine a city where thousands of people switch to EVs, but only a small number have convenient access to charging. Suddenly, the question isn't simply whether electric cars can drive far enough. It's whether drivers can reliably find a working charger when they need one. This becomes especially important for people who live in apartments or park on the street. A homeowner with a garage may be able to charge overnight, but someone without a private parking space may depend heavily on public chargers. That can create a completely different ownership experience. Then there are highways and rural areas. A charging network doesn't just need chargers in major cities. Drivers need confidence that they can travel between cities without constantly worrying about where their next charge will come from. And here's the bigger challenge. More chargers don't automatically mean a better charging network. They have to be available where drivers actually need them. They have to work when drivers arrive. They have to be simple to use, and they have to handle growing demand. Because as more EVs hit the road, charging demand grows with them. That means the challenge isn't simply building more charging stations. It also means expanding the electrical infrastructure needed to support them. So the real battle isn't just about building more electric vehicles. It's about building a charging system and the supporting infrastructure that makes owning one practical and predictable. And that raises a much bigger question. Can the charging network and electrical grid keep up if millions more people switch to electric cars? So here's the question that often gets lost in the EV debate. What happens if millions more people start driving electric cars? Today, charging may work perfectly well for many drivers. But imagine a future where far more vehicles need to recharge every day. Suddenly, the challenge becomes bigger than simply installing more charging stations. Think about a crowded gas station. During a holiday weekend, you may already have to wait for a pump. Now imagine a similar situation with public chargers, where some vehicles may need to remain connected significantly longer before continuing their journey. That doesn't mean the future is doomed. It means the system has to become smarter, more reliable, and better coordinated. Charging stations need to be placed where drivers actually need them. They need to be reliable. They need enough capacity to handle busy locations. And drivers need simple ways to find available chargers without wasting time. There is also a major difference between everyday charging and road trip charging. If millions of people can charge at home, at work, or while their cars are already parked, public charging stations may not face the same level of demand every day. But if large numbers of drivers depend heavily on public charging, demand could become much harder to manage. That's why the future of EVs isn't just a race to build better batteries or faster chargers. It's a race to build a charging system that people can trust. Because ultimately, people don't just want an electric car. They want confidence that wherever they go, they can keep moving. And that brings us back to the question we started with: is charging really the biggest problem with electric cars? Or have we been measuring the problem the wrong way all along? After looking at the full picture, there is an uncomfortable truth. The EV charging debate is often far too simple. Critics are right about one thing: public charging can still be frustrating. A broken charger, a crowded station, or an unexpected delay can turn a simple road trip into a stressful experience. And gasoline vehicles still have a major advantage when it comes to quickly refueling and getting back on the road. But critics can also overlook something important. Not every EV driver depends on public charging. For someone who can charge at home overnight, the experience can be completely different. Instead of making a special trip to refuel, they can often start the day with the car already charged. EV supporters, however, can make the opposite mistake. They sometimes talk as if charging problems don't matter, but they do. People without access to home charging can face a very different reality. Apartment residents, people who park on the street, and drivers who regularly travel long distances may depend heavily on public charging infrastructure. And if that infrastructure is unreliable, the inconvenience is real. So who's wrong? Maybe that's the wrong question. EV charging isn't simply convenient or inconvenient. It depends on your lifestyle, where you live, how far you drive, where you park, and whether you have access to reliable charging. The real debate isn't about whether EV charging is perfect. It isn't. The question is whether the charging experience is good enough for the way you actually use your car. And that's where the truth becomes much more interesting, because the real question isn't whether EV charging is better than gasoline refueling. It's whether it fits your life better. So, are EV charging stations really as terrible as people make them sound? Not exactly, but they're not perfect either. The biggest mistake is treating every driver as if they use their car the same way. For someone with a garage and access to home charging, an EV can be incredibly convenient. You plug in at night, go to sleep, wake up, and drive. No special trip to a gas station, no waiting for the car to refuel. But for someone living in an apartment, parking on the street, or regularly driving hundreds of miles, the experience can be completely different. Public charging is still one of the biggest weaknesses. Chargers can be unavailable, broken, crowded, or slower than expected. And until that experience becomes more reliable and predictable, people will have legitimate reasons to hesitate. But here's the bigger takeaway. The future of EVs may not be decided by how quickly a battery can charge from 0 to 100%. It may be decided by something much simpler. Can drivers trust that a charger will be available, working, and accessible when they need it? Because that's what people really want. Not necessarily the world's fastest charger, not a perfect battery, just the confidence that they can get where they're going without worrying about running out of energy or being stuck somewhere without a reliable charging option. And maybe that's why we've been asking the wrong question all along. The future of electric vehicles isn't just about building better cars. It's about building a charging network people can depend on. And if that happens, one of the biggest arguments against EVs could begin to lose its power. So the next time someone tells you EVs take forever to charge, ask them one question: compared to what, and for what kind of driver? Or